Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a really important discussion. My name is Sadia Tour, and I organize with CUNY for Palestine, or C4P. We're an organization of students and workers at the City University of New York, CUNY, that works in solidarity with the Palestinian people and supports their right to self-determination and national liberation from the river to the sea. We recognize that CUNY is not just a passive spectator to US-backed Zionist settler colonization of Palestine through its contracts and investments in companies that support Israel and US imperialist wars, as well as exchange programs with Israeli universities and other institutional ties. It is a material contributor to Israel's settler colonial rule and the broader US imperialist project of domination in the region, and is complicit in the violent theft of the lives, livelihoods, land, and natural resources of the Palestinian people and the people of the region more generally. Our organizing as C4P is centered in New York City. We recognize that this is the land of the Lenape people and that it was violently taken from them by the US settler colonial project. Today, NYC is an intertribal land under the stewardship of multiple indigenous nations, including the Shinnecock, Taino, Abenaki, and Canarsie nations. We commit to working in solidarity with our indigenous comrades as they fight against the same accumulation by dispossession that we have seen play out in Palestine for over 100 years. Today, we are also joined by comrades from two organizations in Seattle, and I'm going to give the floor over to Britt to introduce them.
I'm actually going to kick it to Glenn, who's going to intro SUPA.
I am Glenn, and I organize with SUPER, which is Students United for Palestinian Equality and Return, which is an SJP chapter at the University of Washington in Seattle. We're a group of youth and students committed to organizing, expanding, and escalating the struggle against Zionism and imperialism, and supporting the resistance until Palestine is free from the river to the sea. SUPER is also a member of the Masar Vadil, the Revolutionary Alternative Path, building power and solidarity in the Palestinian diaspora and among internationalists around the world, and its student wing with the Territorio Network. And I will pass to Vegas.
Hi, everyone. So excited to be here to hear from Nina and Navid. Seattle Against War, or affectionately we say SAW, is a grassroots organization bringing together anti-war, anti-imperialist, and intersectional activists from the Seattle area. Our aim is to confront corporations and politicians who support and profit from imperialist war and genocide, and our strategy is to wage a relentless struggle in the form of consistent and tireless campaigns against these warmongers and their henchmen. Our current target is Representative Adam Smith, who sits on the House Armed Services Committee and represents Congressional District 9. So SAW is also a member of the Anti-War Action Network, or AWAN, and this is a network that includes a lot of anti-war committees across the country that help coordinate actions and national days of action, just, in order for there to be just amplified impact.
Thanks, folks. Karina, you want to?
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Sadia, Britt, Ray, and Glenn for introducing the organizations and the event. And welcome, everyone. Over the past several months, we have watched a brutal imperialist Zionist war on Iran and the broader region unfold alongside the ongoing genocide imperialist Zionist genocide against the Palestinian people. On April 7th, a 2-week ceasefire was announced, brokered by Pakistan, with Washington initially agreeing to its terms and that it would apply to Lebanon as well. But within hours, Israeli bombs killed over 300 people in Beirut. The US then shifted its position, and Iran is continuing to insist that Lebanon is included in the ceasefire and refuses to send a delegation to Islamabad unless the attacks on Lebanon stop. Even some NATO allies, including Germany, Spain, the UK, have openly rejected Trump's calls to join the war. There will not be a return to the status quo. What we are witnessing is the violent convulsion of an empire in decline. In Gramsci's words, this is the time of monsters, impacting not only the West Asian region, but of course also the Americas, the tightening energy blockade and decades-long economic and financial blockade and trade blockade on Cuba, the assault on Venezuela with the direct military intervention in the country and hostage-taking the President Maduro and first combatant Celia Flores, the ongoing imperialist assault on Haiti, and really across the globe. But on the other hand, this is also a moment of profound hopefulness that liberation is near and that another world is possible. Iran has fundamentally changed the balance of forces in the region and globe. The 12-day war last June and now the Ramadan war have shown that the US-Israeli war machine is overstretched, demoralized, exposed, and unable to achieve its strategic objectives. As Navid and Nina Farnia have both put it in a recent interview with Pambazuka News, Iran, this is a quote, presents the greatest threat to Zionist imperialist interests in the region, and the US and Israel are running out of options to topple the Islamic Republic. Iran has not only defended its territory, it has broken the myth of US military invincibility. The axis of resistance forces from Lebanon, Yemen, Palestine, and Iraq coordinates across fronts, stretching US supply lines to breaking point and garnering the support of the region's masses. Iran's indigenous military-industrial program, built under decades of a brutal sanctions regime through a doctrine of self-reliance, has turned the tables. And on the economic front, Iran has, as Nina Farnia has pointed out, effectively nationalized the Strait of Hormuz. I think today there was just an announcement that payments are going to be made in Iranian currency. And I know in the past it was announced that the yuan Chinese currency would be used, controlling the flow of oil, helium, fertilizers, and forcing really the US empire to beg for negotiations. That's kind of what we've witnessed. Our speakers have pointed out the war is materially contributing to decolonizing West Asia and the globe, uprooting US military bases, established US military bases in the region, breaking the petrodollar system, and as Navid put it in a recent Millennials Are Killing Capitalism interview a few weeks ago, disrupting the flows of capital that power the global capitalist economy. Iran is leading a process of delinking, building alternative alliances with countries like Russia, China, Venezuela, and the Sahel states, fortifying its own resistance economy. Sanctions were meant to strangle Iran, and instead they forced Iran to develop its own industry, own medicines, its own weapons. So a real organic delinking process underway. As Nina Farnia reminds us, Iran is the only country in the world with a permanent clause in its national budget that supports the Palestinian Revolution. And this is the kind of solidarity that imperialism cannot forgive. So today we are joined by these two brilliant anti-imperialist scholars, Nina and Navid Farnia, who have been at the forefront of analyzing this moment, and they will help us to better understand the contemporary conjuncture. I'll pass it to Britt now to introduce the speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Karina, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Navid and Nina, we're so lucky to have you guys, and thanks for, all the clarity you've consistently brought to the conversation, and for really, really generously volunteering your time during a really difficult time to do this kind of grassroots political education. We really appreciate it. Just a short intro. Navid Farnia is a professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. His research broadly explores the relationship between racial oppression in the United States and US imperialism, with a focus on revolutionary movements and counter-revolutionary responses. Navid's book manuscript, which I cannot wait to read, National Liberation in an Imperialist World, Race, Counter-Revolution, and the United States, traces the US national security state's evolution by examining how US officials responded to national liberation movements at home and abroad from the 1950s through to 1980. Navid has also written on the impact of economic sanctions imposed by the United States on third world countries, the emergence of a multipolar world order, the South African liberation leader Chris Hani, and the regional dynamics of the ongoing Palestinian liberation struggle. So really honored to have you with us today, Navid. Nina Farnia is a law professor and a legal historian focusing on the role of modern imperialism in US law and politics. Her publications explore a variety of related subjects, including the evolution of the First Amendment as it impacts activism and social movements, US foreign affairs, economic coercive measures, and US fascism. Her doctoral dissertation, Imperialism in the Making of US Law, which is really brilliant and everyone should read it, 1940 to 2008, that's the end of the title of the dissertation, is the 2023 co-winner of the Julian Medsey Dissertation Award for the Association for the Study of Law, Culture, and the Humanities, and is the basis of her forthcoming book, Imperialism and Resistance, which is coming out with Stanford University Press in 2027. And I know a lot of us are really, really looking forward to that book as well. Nina is a longtime member of the NLG, and along with Navid and Karina, a co-founder of the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. So really, really honored to have you both with us. I'm going to pass it to Glenn, who's going to kick off with our first question. Thank you.
Thanks for those intros, and thanks again for being here, Nina and David. I'm really excited. We wanted to start Kind of with a brief context. I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of if you could give a brief overview of sort of modern Iranian history, particularly the Islamic Revolution and subsequent US intervention. A lot of Western Marxists talk about the Islamic Revolution as a revolution betrayed, and we wanted to know what you make of that, and if you could discuss the role of Islamophobia on the left and how that sort of shapes the critiques of the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So, big question, but if you could just kind of give us a brief history before we dive in.
Take that one, Navid. Maybe we can, like, we don't have to both take both. We'll see. I know, we'll see. Thank you so much for the brilliant introduction, Karina, and for the generous introductions to Navid and I, and for organizing this. It's truly an honor to be here with you. So I think there are some things that people generally don't know about Iran and the last sort of century of Iranian history. The first is that Iran has had vibrant and active social movements, whether it's women's movements or labor movements or student movements or even the constitutional revolution for over a century now, at least. The vibrancy of Iranian society that we see in the videos every night when people are pouring into the streets to defend the Islamic Republic, that has a very, very long history that reflects the sort of commitment, the Iranian commitment to both nation and to state. I would say that it's important to mark the 1953 coup, which I think most people know about by now, as a really important moment in Iranian history. There was a coup of a democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh, after he nationalized Iranian oil resources. And he came in through a very, very popular campaign after, a bunch of different labor strikes across the country. And so when that coup happened, they installed the US and England and the UK installed the Shah, the monarch. They reinstalled the monarchy. And this monarchy was incredibly brutal. By the end of the 70s, it was understood by mainstream human rights organizations to be one of the most brutal and repressive governments in the world. And that says a lot because these mainstream human rights organizations rarely say things like that about US-sponsored governments. What's important also is that even though Iran is a very resource-rich country and agriculturally has the capacity to be agriculturally self-sufficient, that period was a period of severe underdevelopment in Iran, that period of the monarchy, where, for example, literacy was in the 30th percentiles, right? And for women in particular, it was in the 20th percentiles. Iran was importing the majority of its food, even though it has an agricultural environment that enables near food sovereignty or food sovereignty. The health indicators were very low. Starvation was high. So it was truly, truly a struggling society until the revolution. And when the revolution occurred, it occurred again through a highly popular campaign that included general strikes, I think 18 months of general strikes across the country. I actually have an article coming out in May or June, comparing these general strikes to the general strikes in Trinidad and Tobago, which were also very significant, though not a little bit off topic. These general strikes were scattered so that, the banks, for example, would go on strike, but they wouldn't stay on strike, for long periods of time so as not to harm the general public, right? So the different sectors scattered the general strikes so that they could show their support for the revolutionary struggle, but still not harm the public as they were doing that. And so that society could continue to function. The revolution basically was, again, a reflection of what I started with, which was a strong student movement, a labor movement, a women's movement, Marxists, Marxist-Leninists, socialists, all the full range, right? And Islamists. And so in that sense, it was truly like a popular front. When the Islamic Republic came into power, how I define it is that the left sort of the secular left lost, right? And so quickly there was the imposition of a new revolutionary government and leadership. And there were struggles in the society, both across the various factions, and then also within each faction. There were struggles around what kinds of policies to put in place, what this new country was going to look like, et cetera, et cetera. This process it continued, right? But the imposition of the invasion of Iraq, the Iraqi invasion, which was a US-backed and US-sponsored invasion, really impacted the progress of the revolution during the 1980s, because immediately after what was considered to be, and I think it still is considered to be, the most popular revolution in modern history, the nation had to defend the new government and the nation itself, because that was a war that was meant to balkanize Iran, or at least take parts of it. That war lasted until 1988. Both Iran and Iraq lost a lot of young people, and both suffered significantly from the war. But it ended and Iran remained intact, right? The borders of Iran remained intact. And then there was what amounts to a true sort of state building and nation building process, like a revolutionary state building and nation building process. And again, the debates between the various factions and within the factions continued. At that point, Ali Khamenei came into power as the supreme leader, and he was what a lot of thinkers and analysts across the political spectrum call a moderating figure, right? He was truly perhaps like his most brilliant skill was bringing different political figures from different factions in, and not just building unity, but actually using that unity to strengthen the state building and nation building process. Right? So that actually, what he was able to really take the revolutionary government to the next level and establish it as to make it, to develop its continuity. Obviously, he wasn't alone in that, but that was one of his skills. So now what's important to know, and I guess this is a direct answer to the question that you ask about the stolen revolution, or what was it? Betrayed? Revolution betrayed or something? Yeah. That's a false framing, because just like all the other sort of segments of society that I described, the people that ended up winning were organizing. They were participating in the revolutionary struggle, and they were organizing. And actually, they were central to the general strike process, to calling for the general strikes, to organizing the general strikes, etc. So this idea of like betrayal is really ahistorical and factually incorrect. It's also incorrect to view the revolution as like an anti-Marxist or anti-socialist revolution, because what happened was that the Islamic Republic integrated a lot of the precepts of nation building that come from socialist states or parties. And so, for example, one of the first things they did was to send their young medical professionals that would become the sort of the health ministers and all that. They sent those people to Cuba to learn how to create a medical infrastructure that serves the people, right? Cuba's a communist government. At that time, it was a communist government. And so you have what is called an Islamic Republic working with communists in a state building project. The other thing that they did, that the Nicaraguans did immediately following their revolution, was a massive literacy campaign. Now, I mean, really within years, right? But especially now, the literacy of women is in the 90th percentiles. Society in general, 90th percentiles. Women are 60% of the university population. The majority of science, technology, engineering, and math graduates are women. There's a social media post circulating right now about, like, as the war goes on, several of the commentators that we're seeing on the news and on and podcasts and stuff are Iranian women. And that's a reflection reflection of the fact that Iranian women are full participants in society, leaders in society, right? That was not the case prior to the revolution. And we're at a time when there was all this talk about women could wear mini skirts, whatever, right? Well, mini skirts are not and have never been known to be a metric of liberation for anybody, anywhere. So I guess I'll end there. I mean, I don't know if you want to add anything. I don't know if I missed anything. I don't know. Karina, you should jump in too, because we forget stuff.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly add. First of all, I want to echo Nina. Thank you, Karina, and all the organizers for having us for this teach-in. Really appreciate it. I'll quickly add. I won't add too much, but I'll just say, like, to answer and respond to the socialist Marxist-Leninist aspect of the question and whether Iran fulfills that particular promise or particular sort of ideological principle. Iran, as Nina has pointed out, if we think about Marxist-Leninism methodologically as dialectical and historical materialism, Iran has fulfilled that principle perhaps more than any so-called leftist movement here in the United States, here in the West, in really in the last century. And so in that respect, we have to think about who is also making those accusations against Iran and from what position are they coming from when they make those accusations, right? I think that is extremely important because, as Nina pointed out, Iranian society fundamentally improved. There was an actual nation building process that the Iranian government engaged in after the revolution, in terms of literacy, like in terms of a literacy campaign, in terms of education in general, in terms of building the country amidst an economic siege, right? Amidst a war, like the Iran-Iraq war, as Nina mentioned, right? And so I think we need to understand Marxist-Leninism in a broader sense than just thinking about it in terms of, like, did Iran become a socialist state in the most classical definitions that are provided by Western Marxists, or methodologically on the ground, what did Iran do that in fact looks much more like, perhaps socialist principles that are rooted again in dialectical and historical materialism, that in fact also resonate to the broader axis of resistance in Yemen, in Lebanon with Hezbollah, in Iraq, right? What does it mean to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, right? That is the fundamental basis of not just anti-imperialism, but also socialism, right? The Cuban Revolution, after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cuba had to become self-sufficient. It's the same thing with the Iranian Revolution, right? Any revolutionary movement has to consolidate itself immediately if it is a true anti-imperialist revolution, because it faces almost immediate imperialist attacks, right? And so that, I think, all of this is an indicator that Iran fulfills the promise of Marxist-Leninism, even if not by name, in practice, and it continues to this day. And in fact, that's the exact reason why Iran is able to resist Zionist imperialist assaults today, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well.
Thank you both. Those are very helpful framings. I wondered if you wanted a piece of that question was also, and I know it's like a multi-part question, part of it was the role of Islamophobia in the left on the US and sort of how that's shaping some of these criticisms. I was curious if any of you, or if either of you would like to discuss that.
Nina, you can go ahead and take that.
So definitely the Western left is secularist and Islamophobic, but it's also just racist. And so, the criticisms of the Iranian Revolution are not unique to Iran, though they have like an Iranian spin to them, right? The Islamophobic spin. But there are also criticisms of the Cuban Revolution, right? That are ridiculous. They're just ridiculous. And they're being echoed and repeated right now as Cuba is under siege by the United States. There are criticisms, ridiculous criticisms of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. And right now, we are hearing the most disgusting accusations being leveled against the Venezuelans and their revolution, instead of leveling accusations and holding accountable the US government that continues to hold the democratically elected leader of Venezuela in a prison cell in New York City. So DPRK, the things that are said about DPRK are super ridiculous. I mean, it's just like they can't even engage DPRK in a serious way. It's just they just make jokes about the Koreans and their revolution and their process of national liberation. Definitely, Islamophobia is a factor. And the West is Islamophobic, right? And the Western left purports to be secularist, but I think racism and sort of an imperialist sort of entitlement to discourse that stems from racism really characterizes the Western left in many ways. And of course, this is not, I want to say, to be honest, we are among the Western left here, right? And so I want to be clear that it's not the whole of the Western left, right? There are institutions and organizations that among the US left that are clear and have struggled for a very long time. But the dominating discourse is fundamentally racist. I don't know if you want to add.
I'll just quickly add to say that I think it's also important to understand what is the historical function of the Western left that Nina has been referring to. Not the anti-imperialist forces that we're talking about, but like the Western left in circles like academic circles. This Western left, which around the world most people would not call it left in the first place, it has a historical function that is in service of imperialism. In fact, the entire reason why it exists in the first place is because the state and the government enables it to exist because it has a particular historical function. And so, we need to start from there. And we need to start from there to understand, okay, these are the racial contradictions that emerge out of this because it is by design an ideological factory for producing anti-revolutionary dissent or anti-revolutionary consent and imperialist consent as well in that respect. The Western left, we can name people, like what is it? And these are people who purport to be pro-Palestine but are anti-resistance. These are people who purport to be, again, pro-Palestine and anti-Zionist but are anti-Iran. As Nina pointed out, Iran is the only state in the world that has and Karina pointed out, citing Nina, that Iran is the only state in the world that has a permanent clause in its constitution and a budget to support the Palestinian people and the resistance. And so these accusations that are fundamentally rooted in Islamophobia, we need to place that in historical context. And that means to think about the structural relationship between the Western left and imperialism itself. And I'll wrap up there.
Thank you. And thank you guys both I really appreciated the material analysis that you've had throughout the response of just like bringing us back to, what are the actual measures of how we know that there's a healthy and, just society. It's not actually miniskirts or these sort of like purported individual freedoms, but what are the health measures or the literacy measures? And one thing I've been thinking about is, your response in the beginning of the forced underdevelopment after the US coup in Iran, and just thinking about that as, in fact, like the only thing that the imperialists and the Zionists can offer, and the thing that is actually their dream for this region right now, right, is the severe underdevelopment and what the axis of resistance and the Islamic Republic is actively fighting against. So my second question for you guys is sort of maybe a little bit forward. It's to talk a little bit about the protest in the December 2025, January of 2026. We know mainstream media has had an interest in distorting these protests, and yet it seems like some of the grievances were justified, although manipulated by external factors. So can you guys discuss the context of these protests and how the US Zionist imperialist forces manipulated and armed insurgents, warmongering, paving the way for this direct imperialist intervention?
So it's important to answer this first by saying that prior to the imposition of sanctions on Russia in 2022, Iran faced the most severe sanctions regime in the world. It's not the longest regime. Cuba or maybe North Korea faced the longest regimes. And Haiti was the first recipient of sanctions after the Haitian Revolution. But Iran, the one that Iran is subject to now, was the most severe until 2022. As part of that sanctions regime, Iranian cash is held up in Western banks or Emirati banks or by Gulf banks, which is one of the demands actually in that Ghalibaf issued today. So they said we're not going to Islamabad for negotiations until the ceasefire takes effect in Lebanon and until our cash is unfrozen. So cash stolen, they couldn't sell their oil or their other materials on the market, on the global market. If they were able to, they would have to sell below market or have institute mechanisms to bypass sanctions to do that. During the pandemic, they could not access critical supplies necessary to serve health supplies necessary to serve the population. A whole host of limitations are imposed on Iran as a result of the sanctions regime. As a result of a Khamenei initiative called the resistance economy, has really strengthened its ability to weather these sanctions since the late 2010s up until now. But the currency manipulation has been severe, and periodically one would face like massive devaluation of its currency, which immediately causes problems for people, for purchasing power, right? For individuals and businesses. And this is what happened in December. In December, basically over the course of a weekend, the Iranian currency dropped to its lowest levels ever. This was a result of some mechanisms instituted by the UAE shorting the currency, but at the behest of the US. And Scott Bessent admitted to it, the Treasury Secretary admitted to it in Davos in January, I believe, where he said that we are engaging in economic statecraft against Iran, and it's working. So that the currency, the value fell. The merchants, a small segment of the merchant class, which is a historically powerful class in Iran, it's been around for thousands of years, protested. And the government immediately met with them, met with labor, began to come to some solutions to address their concerns. And then almost immediately after that, this urban warfare campaign began in Iran. And we saw US officials, the former head of the CIA, for example, posting on Twitter, Happy New Year to our CIA operatives in the streets of Tehran. Israeli news channels said that the Mossad is funding this operation and that there are Mossad agents in the streets.
Quickly also, let me add, Nina, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Mossad itself tweeted to Iranians saying that we are, quote unquote, we are with you on the streets, right? Yeah. Mossad's own Twitter account also said that. Sorry, go ahead. No,
it's okay. And it's important to understand how horrific this operation was. And I say this every single time I'm asked about this operation. We actually saw images of living people, living human beings being dismembered in the streets with axes. People were being set on fire. And I read that they were trying to set people's genitalia on fire in the streets. Our family was said like, we have never witnessed anything as horrific as what we just witnessed. It was very scary and very disgusting. Fortunately, though, it did not last very long. And Navid will talk, I think Navid will talk about why. So this amounts to or looked like what we saw when ISIS was at its height in the region. And then the Iranian government, after it ended, came out and said this was a coup attempt. There were social media campaigns targeting Iranians, Persian language social media campaigns targeting Iranians with made up young people that look cute and whatever, saying no mercy, don't express any mercy as you go out into the streets. This is what people were seeing. So there was nothing legitimate about the urban warfare campaign that occurred. And really, those protests, those few days of protests were entirely different than what happened in Tehran a few weeks later. They're two different phenomena entirely.
Yeah, I'll just add a few things. To Nina's point, first of all, the protests that emerged in December, the Bazaris were clear that these were not anti-government protests. That's first and foremost. That they were related to the economic situation, and as Nina pointed out, the economic situation was fundamentally driven by the current currency manipulation of the United States. And Scott Bessent said that himself. Secondly, again, to point out, to add to Nina's picture of brutality that she painted, right? There are videos of there's a video of an elderly man just walking on the street, and these masked and hooded people come across him, mug him, kick him down, take his stuff, right? These are not protests. This is, as Nina pointed out, this is urban warfare, urban insurgency, right? in many respects. And so how did Iran end it? For one, Iranian security forces activated en masse on, I believe, January 8th and 9th, and basically put down those 2 days, I think 7th and 8th maybe, were the two heaviest days of urban warfare, and the Iranian security forces put it down, not without heavy losses themselves. In fact, of the over 3,000 people who were killed during this urban war, over 2,000 of them were Iranian security forces. So it wasn't like, protesters or whatever. It was actually Iranian security forces. And on top of that, like Iran released all the names of the people who were killed. So whenever you all see like these numbers of 30, 40,000, I don't know, as high as 90,000 people were killed, Iran actually released a name of 3,000 plus, 3,100 plus people who were killed. So again, think about where you're getting these numbers from, right? The other thing, and perhaps the more important thing, is on January 14th. Again, I think it's on January 14th. The Iranian public, the Iranian people came out on the streets in the millions in support of the government to put down these urban riots, this urban war. And quickly after that was the end of it. After that, there were no like even murmurs anymore of like this urban war. And to be clear, like this urban war, as Nina pointed out, was stoked. It was directed and orchestrated by Mossad and the United States. Mike Pompeo, as Nina pointed out, and people like this were stoking it and all that. But on top of that, like the tactics that they were using, as Nina said as well, mimicked ISIS, and in many respects, like also like were concurrent with what ICE was doing here in the United States, on the streets of the United States, and also like were related to and looked like what the Zionists were doing in Gaza. So if tactically what they're doing looks exactly like what the Zionists are doing, if the Zionists are flat out saying we're out there on the streets with you, then what is this? Is this like a real authentic uprising? Or is it something else? And so all of the evidence points to the reality that this was, in fact, a coup attempt, and it was a failed coup attempt. As we've seen time and time again, the Zionists and the U.S. have exhorted the quote-unquote Iranian people to rise up against their government. And time again, the Iranian people have done the exact opposite. And that goes to show you that there's mass support for the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic, ongoing support over 47 years. And so that shows the strength of the Iranian state. It's not limited to one person, so they can carry out whatever assassinations they want. As Iranian officials have pointed out, we are rooted in our institutional development. So we're not just limited to one person. And so again, think about like what do the assassinations and these kinds of things mean? And we can talk about that as well. But I just want to point out that the urban war that emerged out of like small scale protests that were not anti-government in the first place was a complete failure. And it was a Zionist imperialist attempt to overthrow the government that failed.
Thank you both so much. I'll pass on to the next.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really enlightening and insightful to hear the reflections on this current moment. I'm Hajar, CUNY law student here for CUNY for Palestine. Moving up to kind of more the present moment, lots of people have kind of described Iran's role in resisting U.S. and Zionist imperialist aggression on Iran, particularly the targeting of U.S. imperialist military bases in the Gulf and the effective nationalization of the Strait of Hormuz as a form of material decolonization for the region, which kind of serves the interests of oppressed people globally by kind of striking at the heart of the mechanisms of domination and accumulation upholding this Western imperialism. So I guess I kind of wanted to get your description about this assessment, and if you could explain it, if you agree with that, and if not.
Go ahead, Nina, and I'll. I broadly agree with that assessment. I think that Nina, others have pointed out. Karina pointed out as well in the opening, Iran has nationalized Hormuz, and that means that the tankers and the ships that Iran allows to pass through Hormuz at this point are doing so by paying a toll to Iran. And again, Karina pointed this out in the opening. And it's been reported that it's the equivalent of $2 million that Iran is charging per ship. And if Iran continues to do this, and it looks like Iran's going to, because they have said that we're not going back to the procedures that existed before the war, like we're taking control of Hormuz. In other words, if Iran continues to do this, then at $2 million per ship or around that, then we're talking about tens of billions of dollars per year that essentially is being recouped from all the money that has been stolen from them from sanctions, right? And of course, as Nina said, Iran is also demanding the unfreezing of Iran's assets that have been stolen as a basis for negotiation. So I believe it's like the Qatar and South Korea, I believe we're scrambling to unfreeze $7 billion worth of assets, I read this morning, as a basis to begin negotiations in Pakistan. And so all of this reflects, that Iran has control, and Iran is in fact engaging in a process of systematic decolonization. That means, yes, nationalization of Hormuz. That means waging a war that's not just, yes, attacking like U.S. bases in the region, in the Gulf, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Iraq. And of course, Iran's allies are centrally participating in this as well. Like, for example, the Iraqi resistance has been extremely successful in its operations against U.S. bases in Iraq and also the U.S. embassy in Iraq, to such an extent that most U.S. forces have evacuated from the country. And so it is a systematic decolonization, but it's not just limited to the bases. It's not just limited to Hormuz, but Iran and its allies have also said that they're going to target all of like the integrated security umbrella of the Zionist imperialists in the region. That means attacking banks, because Iranian banks have been attacked by the United States. So Iran attacked banks in, I believe, UAE, it's like Citibank and these kinds of banks, right? During the Ramadan war. That means attacking petrochemicals, oil refineries as part of this as well. It means attacking the technology sector, which is fundamentally contributing to the Zionist imperialist war on Iran. Attacking Oracle, which, incidentally, Iran attacked Oracle on the same day that Oracle, I believe, laid off 30,000 employees or something like that. I don't think that's a coincidence, by the way. Attacking Microsoft, Amazon data centers, attacking Google, so on and so forth. And so the entire security architecture of the United States and the Zionists is being attacked across the region. And that shows that this decolonization is systematic, and that Iran understands that it's not limited to like Iran, that the US's security architecture is not just about its bases, but it's about all of this, right? And so that's what it means to engage in decolonization. Yes, it's about the military installations, but it's also about finance and economic and capital and these kinds of things. And it's also about like the factors that are leading to the underdevelopment of the region in general, right? And the continuing occupation, of course, as well. And all of this will resonate politically as well. We'll see what's going to happen in a place like Bahrain. Bahrain is, I believe, around 80% Shia, and it's controlled by like a monarchy that is completely against the people, that is in the pockets of its Gulf allies and, of course, of the United States. The United States' most important naval base in the region is in Bahrain. So we'll see what happens politically with the Bahraini government, because the people already don't see that as a legitimate government. We'll see what happens in Kuwait, right? We'll see what happens in all these places. I saw a video last week, actually a few days before the ceasefire, in which there was an attack on Saudi oil installations. And the people who were recording the video were actually celebrating. This notion that whatever Saudi population supports the government in Saudi Arabia. Like, let's see. Again, we haven't even talked about like the rest of the axis of resistance. That's a larger conversation as well. Yeah, go ahead.
Just piggybacking off of what Navid said, I just want to say something short, and then I'll talk about the Strait of Hormuz. First, there have been all these criticisms of Iran that it's insufficiently anti-capitalist, or that it is itself capitalist. But I ask you, has anybody ever in their lifetimes seen anything more anti-capitalist than this? I mean, has anything, including all the great communist and anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist nation states in the world right now, anything that is more confrontational and more directly anti-capitalist than this? I don't think we can even debate that. I don't think so. And the Iranians were clear. They were very clear. There's a really famous Iranian analyst named Khoshchesh who came on sort of the Iranian nightly talk shows. I saw him on Mayadeen last night too. He came on like in January or February when the US was building up in the region. So this must have been February or March. And he said, look, like our definition of targets is broad, as Navid described, right? We're going to we're going to target the architecture of US imperialism, the architecture that has undermined our sovereignty for dozens of years. And that is precisely what they're doing. I want to also now talk about the Strait of Hormuz because it's super, super interesting. So the Strait, or actually, do you want me to talk about Hormuz? Do you want to yeah? Okay. So the Strait is approximately 35 miles-ish, I think miles. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think it might be kilometers, but
Kilometers, okay. I guess, Western left mistake. So I apologize. So 35 kilometers long or wide. That's tiny, as you know. Part of it is Iranian territory, coastal seas. Part of it is Omani. There is no such, people have been talking about like international seas and stuff. There's no legal concept of international seas. The deeper part of the strait that's easier to pass through is actually in Iranian waters. And notably, I can't remember if Oman has, but Iran has not ratified the UN Charter on the Law of the Seas or many of the other international maritime legal instruments. And so the idea that either under international law, the world is entitled to the strait, international customary law, etc., is completely incorrect. There's no legal basis for it. So what Iran is doing effectively is nationalizing the strait. It is Iranian territory and Omani territory, and Iran and Oman together are creating a new legal architecture for passage through the strait. Now, this is post-war. This is a post-war architecture. There's also a sort of war architecture. And during warfare, it's incredibly clear under international law that Iran can control the strait because as a matter of defense, Iran is allowed not to allow any passage by hostile or potentially hostile forces through the strait. Anything that passes through the strait, any materials that pass through the strait that can be used to support hostile forces can be prevented from passing through. So the international legal system, with all its faults and failings that we are obviously aware of post-genocide, post-Palestinian genocide, is not post, as a result of the Palestinian genocide, the ongoing genocide, but in general, international law has been a problem since its inception. Despite all these problems and limitations, it actually upholds Iranian control of that, Iranian and Omani control of that area.
Thanks so much for that. I'm going to pass it along to the next panelist.
Hello, I'm Joseph with the Seattle Against War. And my next question for you all is kind of talking about the petrodollar. We know that since about the 70s, the United States has required various countries to exclusively price their oil in the US dollar, giving rise to a kind of dominance of US dollars and making it the global reserve currency. Now, obviously, because of the stances being taken by Iran, how close do you think we are or were to the collapse of the petrodollar and as an effect of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz during this current war? And if the petrodollar were to collapse, what do you think that would mean for US imperialism?
you can go ahead, Nina. I'll pick up.
Okay. So the petrodollar has been in a slow decline for several years now, but especially following the imposition of sanctions on Russia. And the underlying mechanism that has really caused its downfall is the sanctions regime, because so much of the world is under sanctions right now, either unilateral coercive measures imposed by the United States or multilateral coercive measures imposed through the UN, that these countries are now finding alternative ways to work together and trade. And so it was like it was ridiculous, right? For them to sanction over 1/3 of the planet, in addition to being truly a reflection of modern colonialism and theft. That said, and up until the second Trump administration, there was a lot of movement around developing international financial mechanisms through BRICS to enable trade. That stuff sort of, almost as soon as the second Trump administration began, and he imposed all of these tariffs around the war, on different nations around the world, on much of the world, and then started their really aggressive military campaigns. That process has slowed a bit. So I don't think we're looking at the immediate collapse of the petrodollar, but I do think that I don't know what the cliche is, the cat is out of the bag or whatever, right? Like we've reached a phase of the process where it's become irreversible. And Iran's role in nationalizing Hormuz is probably a significant inflection point in that process. But we actually have not yet seen or felt the effects of it yet, really, especially those of us that are in the United States. The Eastern Hemisphere and Europe have really started to feel it in a way much more seriously than we have. Karina can speak about this much better than I can. And so I urge you to jump in here, Karina. The real problem with the international system, that what upholds imperialism is the financial architecture of the international system. And so in order for any real change to happen, that architecture has to change. It has to like be, the imperialist architecture has to be eliminated, and a new architecture that is anti-imperialist and that supports global South nations, especially nations like Venezuela and Cuba and DPRK, etc., the Alliance of Sahel States, that the new architecture has to support the integration of those nations into the international system. Until that happens, we're not looking at like a rapid shift, I think. I'm eager to hear what Navid and Karina would say.
Karina, go ahead. I'd be interested to hear what you say as well. No, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Nina. That was perfect. It's everything I would have said, but please go ahead, Navid.
I don't really have much to add to what Nina said, other than to say that, the fact that, Trump imposed these tariffs on all these nations, strong-armed India to not buy Russian oil, the fact that, many countries have been suffering, particularly in Southeast Asia, from Iran, from the war. And they're not blaming Iran, by the way. They're blaming the United States and the Zionists. All of this, and all of this shows to me that, and also I'll also add, whether this is consequential or not in the short term, I actually think it's consequential in the long term. The Supreme Court ruling that Trump's tariffs are unconstitutional, these things have meaning both economically and politically, right? And so the Iran's control of Hormuz meant that India went back to Russia to buy its oil, and at the behest, and the Trump government had to give the okay for that as well. They were not in a position to deny that. The opening up of Russia's oil reserves to be once again consumed by other parts of the world. The fact that China is increasingly buying more oil from Russia as well as a result of this war. And of course, the fact that the sanctions against Iranian oil have by and large been lifted because of Iran's strategic victory and control of Hormuz. That all of these things, perhaps we're not seeing the effect on the petrodollar materially yet. All of these things bode positively for the effect on the petrodollar and for the entire financial architecture that Nina described of imperialism, of U.S. imperialism. So that might look slower than some of these other things that we're seeing. It might actually go under the radar. But I think all of these things, I'll add, the fact that countries like Vietnam and Thailand are having to go to China for example, renewable resources and energy because there is a limited access to oil and gas, right? These things all show that energy hegemony of the United States and the Western world are basically in large part at an end, right? And so we're just beginning that. We're just beginning that process. But again, I want to see what Karina says.
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with everything that you both have said, and I would add that we can connect it back to sanctions too, and really diminishing the power of sanctions, which depend upon the U.S. control of that economic and financial architecture, like the SWIFT banking system, which basically controls all of the transactions in relation to trade across the globe. And if the U.S. loses control of, of the dollar, of dollar hegemony. It loses control of these financial, this financial and economic architecture. It's already, as you've said, there's the BRICS banking system, alternatives already emerging. This Iran is accelerating, through this nationalization of the Hormuz. What is it? 20%, I think, of the oil traded in the world market goes through the Strait of Hormuz. Even just taking that commodity and trading it in an alternative currency, whether it's the local currency or Chinese currency, already will have a huge impact on the dollar. And then these broader transformations that are occurring as a result of the emergence of this polycentric or multipolar world order that I think will really diminish the US's ability to control and to impose unilateral coercive measures on countries like Iran and on any country that, even exercises a modicum of sovereignty, really, because that's what sanctions have been used for. I think you mentioned 1/3 of the globe, that is impacted by sanctions. So yeah, just to add to that, I think it's an accelerator in this process that's already underway, and that is good for the globe. That's good for the global majority. Thank you both.
Perja, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you for that analysis of kind of like the financial architecture and the ramifications of what this current moment means. Shifting gears a little bit to talk about the current state of the US and Zionist war of aggression on Iran. Is the supposed ceasefire a win for Iran? And what do you think Iran will do given the repeated violations by Israel? And also, why were the US and Israel so eager to put an end to the war?
Navid, you go ahead for this.
Yes, I do believe this ceasefire is a strategic victory for Iran. And as I've said elsewhere, I also believe that the violations of the ceasefire by the Zionists, particularly, are a reflection of weakness. Like all these bombings in Lebanon, specifically Beirut, all of this reflects a position of weakness. Even Zionist society, even Zionist politicians and journalists are saying that this ceasefire is a negative, is a setback for the Zionist regime and the Zionist entity. So absolutely, this ceasefire, regardless of whatever violations, and in fact, the violations, as I said, confirm the reality that Iran is in a position of strength. All of this tells me that Iran is approaching the negotiating table also from a position of strength. The fact that Iran has refused, Iranian officials are continually refusing are saying that they're going to refuse to negotiate unless the Zionists are basically, reined back by the United States. And in fact, the Zionists, they have been reined back. The violations are still occurring, but they're less than they, for example, were like even yesterday, right? And I should also add, this is an aside, but like Hezbollah has engaged in over 50 operations yesterday, and it's engaged, last I checked, over almost 50 already today. And so like whatever we want to say about the strength of the resistance, like the Lebanese resistance, Hezbollah is like very, very strong and doing very well. And, there was another security incident this morning, like these kinds of things are happening. So all of this shows that battlefield developments are reflecting that Iran and the axis of resistance are approaching negotiations from a position of strength. Iran, like the United States and Trump himself said at the outset of the ceasefire, the supposed ceasefire, that Iran's 10-point proposal is an acceptable basis on which to begin negotiations, right, for the end of the war. And what are those 10 points? One, we've talked about a few of them, or at least a couple of them. One, the lifting of sanctions. Two, Iran is going to take control of Hormuz going forward. So the situation in Hormuz, again, is not going to be what it was before the war. Three, the ending of the war on all fronts. So not just with respect to Iran, but also Yemen, also Iraq, also Palestine, and of course also Lebanon, right? Four, Iran's right to nuclear enrichment. And I think perhaps the most important one for our conversation is the closure of U.S. bases in the region and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from the region. So all of these. So also another one is compensation for Iran's losses in the war. So all of these indicate if this is an acceptable basis for negotiations to begin, according to Trump, which we know they're going to be duplicitous. They already have been, right? And Iran also knows this as well. But nonetheless, to even come at it from this position shows that Iran knows what it's doing with respect to negotiations, that it's treating negotiation seriously, and it's also relating those negotiations based on its gains in the battlefield as well, right? And I think we need to be clear about that, the relationship between the battlefield developments and the negotiations that are set to take place. And the fact that Iran is also threatening to not negotiate if these basic principles, for example, the ceasefire in Lebanon, is not met, that also shows that Iran is not only willing to go back to military hostilities, but in fact, like, is prepared to do so. And in fact, and I think is going to do so if and when these negotiations fall apart. So I think Iran understands all of this, right? And yeah, so I'll let Nina pick up.
I don't have much else to add other than that this was just going to be a 2-week ceasefire, probably at best. It might have extended longer, but obviously it hasn't even begun really yet. And the war is ongoing, and all parties are that the war is ongoing, and they're saying as much, and they've been saying as much basically since the 12-day war in June. So, for us as activists and scholars who, are engaged in struggle and anti-imperialist struggle, we need to be prepared for the fact that in war, there are always ceasefires, and they are for a variety of reasons, many, many different reasons. But this war is ongoing. No one has said we are at the end of the war, not a single player. And whatever happens with this ceasefire, however long, if it actually starts, however long it lasts, it won't be the end.
And let me just add a couple more things quickly. To Nina's point, like, ceasefires are absolutely a part of wars. During the US war in Vietnam, there was like a 30-day Christmas truce or whatever, right, in which the United States halted its bombing campaign in North Vietnam. And so, like, these kinds of things are very normal. They're not atypical, and it doesn't mean that, and of course, the United States and the Zionists, of course, they want to peel Iran off of the axis of resistance, but there is no indication whatsoever that that's happening. Over the last day, I think only one oil tanker has crossed Hormuz at Iran's permission. So the opening of Hormuz has not happened because the ceasefire in Lebanon has not yet set. And so again, this shows that Iran is operating closely with its allies in the region. Iranian officials have said that any attack on Hezbollah in Lebanon is tantamount to an attack on Iran, right? And so, these things we need to be clear about as well. And the other thing as well, to what Nina said, U.S. forces are continuing to build up in the region. They're sending, as we speak, they're sending cargo planes to the region right now, right? On the other hand, Iran, this is an opportunity for Iran, if whatever missile sites and bases that have been hit, to especially entryways into missile sites, to clear up those missile sites so that they can launch missiles from those sites that have been hit, that were hit during the war, especially in Western Iran, right? So this is also a time to tactically regroup and to position yourself better for when active hostilities begin again.
Yeah, and thinking about kind of more long-term effects in the region, I guess do you think that this escalation has altered the political calculus for the other Gulf states in terms of their role in propping up U.S. imperialism, especially those who are host to American military bases?
You go ahead, Navid, on this.
I think the calculus was already starting to be altered before the war. I think countries like Saudi Arabia have been forced to come to grips with the reality that U.S. imperialism, not just in the region, but in the world, is declining. And this is why we've seen, for example, relations and ties, bilateral relations between Saudi Arabia and China, for instance. And so this war has only accelerated the process by which these countries have had to reevaluate their relationship with imperialism, with the United States in particular. Because I think embedded in your question as well is the reality that these countries have not been protected during this war. These bases were built on the promise of protection in case, a country like Iran attacks Bahrain or Kuwait or whatever, right? That has not been the case. The interceptors that have been operating, they've been operating to protect U.S. interests and bases in the region. And so these are the realities that the Gulf countries are forced to confront. And of course, that is not even to talk about the populations within those countries, right? We talked about that a little bit earlier, but what does it mean for the population of Bahrain? The fact that fifth naval fleet in Bahrain, the U.S. That is the U.S. naval base, that has been hit so hard to such an extent that U.S. forces have evacuated the bases and are now like positioned in hotels and other civilian institutions as a way to protect themselves. Of course, like this is what it means to use human shields, right? Like they accuse the Palestinians of resistance of doing that, and that's exactly what they're doing, right? So what are the implications of that for the population? Like how is the population going to receive that? How is it receiving that already? The other aspect of this is, and we haven't even talked about like the UAE. The UAE's genocide in Sudan, right? What does this mean for the UAE's military operations in support of the rapid support forces in Sudan? We're only beginning to see the ripple effects of that. And so that is going to really damage the UAE's larger ambitions. And the UAE is basically like, we call it the UZE, the United Zionist Emirates, right? The UAE is basically the United States and the Zionists. But whatever ambitions it has, not just in the West Asia region, but also in the Horn of Africa and in North Africa, those are going to be hindered by the fact that Iran has hit the UAE very hard. Right. And the UAE is as an active participant in this aggression against Iran, right? Like there have been reports and there's an evidence of UAE fighter jets operating over Iranian territory. And, like there was a tweet by an Emirati official the other day saying that the UAE dominated and won this war, right? Like these are so this is like the propaganda that they're trying to put out to save their own faces, right?
I thought that tweet was a joke.
No, that was real. So, yeah, that was real. And so the ripple effects are not just regional, like they're both continental and they also affect the African continent as well. And we need to be clear about that, right? And this is why, for me, like, and I think, and Nina and others of us who are like, see like what's going on and who are anti-imperialists, we don't see, for example, what's happening with Iran as independent of what's happening, not just with Palestine in the region, but also with Sudan. Right? We don't see that as independent from that. We don't see it as independent from what's happening with respect to Russia, right? These are all like, this is World War III, right? Like, one of our colleagues talked about the U.S. waging World War III in pieces. That's exactly what's happening, right? And so we need to bring these fronts together to understand what is the larger situation that's going on, right? And so I think we need to be clear about that. I don't know if Nina wants to add to that as well, but yeah.
I just want to just touch on the populations of the Gulf countries that have shown such strong support for the Iran and its actions in the region. There's actually an Iranian scholar named Hassan Ahmadian. He teaches at the University of Tehran on Al Jazeera. He speaks like beautiful Arabic, just very fluent. He's very conversant and comfortable in Arabic. So he went on Al Jazeera Arabic, and he basically took on a panel of Gulf officials and scholars, and he decimated them in Arabic. And since then, he's like become this hero for the peoples of the Arab region because he's in their language defending their struggles against their countries. And the reason that they are not able to do it in the way that he has done it is because the repression in those Gulf countries is so severe. It's so severe that they haven't been able to show to the extent necessary how much they hate their governments and how much they support what Iran is doing in the region. Just the first week of the war, we began to see like people really, really coming out in support of Iran. And then we saw like images of people being picked up and tortured, and we heard stories about it. So the repression is incredibly severe. And what has happened is that this like sort of quote unquote sectarianism that took hold over the region, largely as a result of Al Jazeera, frankly, but it reached a peak around Syria in the 2010s. That is falling apart. That sectarianism is falling apart. And what we're seeing is that what remains of it are these U.S. stooges, these like dictatorial families, right? They're just families that are really like houses of cards. They're houses of cards, and we're gonna see them sort of fall apart, I think, pretty soon. But check out, you won't be able to understand what Dr. Ahmadian says if you don't speak Arabic, but just watch him as he's so calm, so eloquent. It's really unbelievable. And the article that Navid mentioned by our colleague is by Toussaint Lossier. I think it's titled A Third World War in Pieces or something.
Yeah, Pursuing a Third World War in Pieces.
Yeah, it's an excellent article.
Yeah, and let me just add one more thing because I'm sure all of you have a sense of like how horrible UAE is. But like a few months ago, the Zionists announced their diplomatic recognition of Somaliland, right? Like the secessionist movement in Somalia, right? The UAE has been supporting that for years now. The UAE has been attempting to redraw the borders again of both the West Asia and Horn of Africa regions for years. Like this is part of their task. That's why they support the Rapid Support Forces in Sudan. And that's why they support also Somaliland. They've also tried to spur a secessionist movement in Yemen, in southern Yemen, and they failed, miserably because of the Yemeni resistance, Ansar Allah, right? So, we need to be clear about how these forces are acting in the region, what exactly they're doing, and we need to relate the region with other regions as well.
Lima, I think you're up next if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I just also posed a question. Can someone type in the author's name in the chat? Sorry. Okay. Catching up. So could you discuss the long-standing and ongoing use of Orientalist tropes in propaganda by the West to try and characterize Iran as a uniquely hostile actor in the region and in general in the world? This isn't directed at any particular person, so
I'll take it.
jump in.
So these tropes are actually sort of far-reaching and extend beyond the racists, the sort of avowed racists. There's like a lot of Iran-specific rhetoric, like that the Shia don't fear death and embrace martyrdom, and that's why the Iranians are the only ones capable of doing what's been done so far. There's obvious, and this is rhetoric that has been spouted both by Trump administration officials like Rubio. Rubio actually was like, how can we fight these like fanatics who don't even like know the difference between life and death? He said that after the assassination of Khamenei, because Khamenei was, he wasn't like in a bunker somewhere or whatever. He was in his home office, which everybody knows. Everybody knows what the location of that home office. So when they bombed it, it's not clear to me that they actually intended to kill him. They might have, but it's possible that they didn't. And so then they came out like a couple days later saying like, this thing that Rubio said. So on the one hand, Rubio is saying it, but on the other hand, like even segments of the left are saying this. And then there's just sort of like, the narrative of backwardness and, like the, inherently backward, anti-woman, and misogynistic, patriarchal, etc. But the war has actually undermined a lot of this. It's really interesting because people, the social media discourse around Ibrahim Zulfiqari, the Khatam al-Anbiya's PR person that does those daily hourly briefings really on the war. The fact that he's holds a PhD and speaks 4 languages, the rhetoric around the foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, and his dissertation on, I don't even know what, some Western philosopher, Larijani, who was recently assassinated, unfortunately, his dissertation was on Kant. People are very impressed for whatever, for what it's worth. Like people are very impressed that the majority of Iranian officials are actually highly educated, not only about their own society and their own people and their own history, but specifically about Western history. They speak Western languages. They speak Hebrew. They read and write Hebrew. Zulfiqari did one of his press conferences in Hebrew. He spoke directly to Trump in English, right? And so a lot of and then we haven't even mentioned the Lego videos, right? I mean, everybody, like I have like law professor colleagues that are like super impressed by these Lego videos. And so the veil of Orientalism that has targeted Iran specifically has been pierced to some extent. It may come back again, right, depending on what happens around the war. But I don't know. I think it's become clear to most Americans that Asia is the future, right? I mean, Asia is the future as Americans are still drinking contaminated water and schools have mold and asbestos, and as American infrastructure is falling apart, we can't find doctors when we need them, etc. That's not the case in parts of Asia. And so I think to some extent the veil has been pierced. But I just want to add on this note about Shia resistance. There is indeed a dimension of the Iranian resistance, an important dimension of it that is rooted in Shia philosophy and the martyrdom of Imam Ali and Imam Hussein and the what that means to the culture and the society. But Iranians are not special. There's nothing special about Iranians. There's nothing special about Palestinians. There's nothing special about Zionism. There's nothing special about the violence that we face. There has been extraordinary and disgusting violence and savagery imposed on much of the world. And there's also been extraordinary and victorious resistance. And the people of Korea embody that resistance. The people of the DPRK embody that resistance. The people of Vietnam embodied that resistance. The people of Cuba continue to embody that resistance. The people of Venezuela, the people of Southern Africa, the Sahel states, the Chinese, the Russians, etc., 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 the Nicaraguans. And so Iran is a part of that history. It's a central part of that history. It has its own culture, just like all those other peoples. Iran has its own culture that strengthens it and gives it power. But Iran is like all those other peoples, no different. And the Zionists, they are incredibly disgusting and evil, but all of these peoples have faced disgusting evil, and the Zionists are no different. The only thing that makes the genocide of the Palestinians different is that it was live streamed before all our eyes. But if you read about what the Germans did in Namibia or what the Belgians did in Congo, these guys have been disgusting, they are disgusting, and they will continue to be disgusting until their time comes to an end.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Nina and Joseph. I think we'll try to do one more question, I think, and then, see how we go. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So we've seen some pretty crazy rhetoric and some pretty crazy statements made by Donald Trump recently. And I want to ask, how real do you think that the threat of a nuclear attack on Iran is? And what do you think about, Trump's crazy statements like a whole civilization will die tonight? Is this just bluster? Is this him just spouting off? And if so, what do you think that kind of rhetoric is trying to achieve?
Go ahead, Navid, since I took the last one.
So I guess I'll start by saying that Trump himself, as we can talk about like the level of mental instability or whatever, right? That Trump, that Trump has. But I think what is clear is that Trump plays on the notion that on the perception of him being mentally unstable. He plays on this notion of like being a madman who's unpredictable. Like this madman philosophy actually began under Nixon. Like Nixon practiced this madman philosophy during the time that the U.S. was waging its bombing campaign in Southeast Asia. And so, I'm like I don't want to predict and say like what the U.S. government is going to do, whether under Trump or anybody else, right? What I will say is that the tweets that he's been making, like power plants and bridges and the end of Iranian civilization and all that are markers of desperation to me. Like the fact that they cannot achieve their objectives on the battlefield. They cannot achieve their objectives economically, right? And so they have to, and so Trump has resorted to more and more genocidal rhetoric, more threatening kind of rhetoric as a way to advance, like to gain a semblance of leverage in the entire process. So there's that element of it. But the other aspect of it to me that people have not necessarily talked about with respect to the prospect of U.S. nuclear or even Israeli nuclear strikes on Iran is the fact that if this is the decision that they take, for one, that doesn't necessarily guarantee a military victory over Iran and the axis of resistance. That's one. But two, it opens up a whole world of reality where now other nuclear states see this, right? And now the continental United States becomes an open target because of whatever preemptive or preventative strikes that the United States might engage in Iran. And so if I'm Russia and I'm seeing like a nuclear strike, okay, this is the world now, right? If I'm China and I'm seeing this, and both of these countries can hit the United States, and let's be clear about that. And so that has to be part of the calculation for the US government. whether it's Trump or not himself or not. Like the prospect of opening up this can of worms has to be part of like, you know, and the deterrence capacity and these notions of deterrence. You know, Russia and China are right there. They're right there. Russia is in active hostilities against NATO right now. And the Russian officials have been clear, like, you know, if you're thinking about whatever you're thinking about in Russia, whatever kinds of attacks you want to engage in Moscow, then nuclear strikes are on the table. And we have to. So again, this is the importance of thinking of all these hostilities in one larger war, right? The other thing I'll say about this is that I think it's a pretty poorly kept secret that we don't know what Iran's nuclear capabilities are. The highly enriched uranium, you know, the amount that we know of has the capacity for, I believe, 20 high-yield nuclear warheads, and the capacity for almost 100 low-yield tactical nukes, low-yield nuclear warheads. We don't know, like Iran is basically a nuclear ambivalent power, which means that the world does not know the extent to which Iran has developed its nuclear capacity. And I think Iran has been playing on that as well, right? The operation last week that the United States engaged in, that special operation that the United States engaged in Isfahan, south of Isfahan, it seemed to be about Iran's, pilfering and stealing Iran's highly enriched uranium. Of course, that operation was a total failure. So much so that the United States claimed that the operation was actually about rescuing its pilot or whatever. But, you know, all this to say that we don't know, we don't know what Iran's capabilities are. And I think Iran has been purposeful about that, right? And that's not to say to encourage like whatever heightening of escalation that might occur, but it is to say that Iran is aware of the reality of the prospect of any kind of attack against its territory and against its people. And so it is preparing for that.
I just want to add, neither of us are experts on nuclear warfare or and we've obviously never experienced it. As early as November 2023, human rights organizations were reporting that Israel had hit Gaza with the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs. That was just in November of 2023. And I don't mean to say that the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs is the same as scientifically is the same as nuclear bombs, right? It is not. You know, what hit Japan, what the US did to Japan, to Nagasaki and Hiroshima is different. It's just important to know that we have already surpassed a certain threshold. And if the Trump administration does escalate to the levels that the tweets indicated, Iran is not what Japan was, right? And Iran is obviously not Gaza. Iran has the capacity for resistance. It has the willingness to resist. It sees itself as a leader in the world historical struggle against US imperialism. And there is no indication at all that Iran will stop. And because it's such a large nation, like just geographically, it is a large, large nation. Destroying it from a geographical perspective is impossible. It's impossible. And if you look at the maps that were circulated, the topographical maps that have been circulated on social media since the war began, you'll see with your eyes why Iran is the longest standing continuous nation in the world. There are mountains and deserts at all the borders. It is not an easy country to invade. It is just not. And it is not an easy civilization to destroy. So, I agree with everything that Navid said. The unpredictability of the Trump administration is part of the project, but, as Adorchi said, and maybe we should end with this, we are waiting for them. I don't think he was lying when he said that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Let me add quickly to what Nina said. I think the equivalent now at this point in Gaza is dozens of nuclear, and yet the Palestinian resistance continued to operate all the way until and even beyond the ceasefire in October of last year. So whatever strikes that the Zionists and the United States engaged in did nothing to the Palestinian resistance, right? And it's the same thing with respect to Iran. Iran, just like in Gaza, has all of these tunnels, and whatever nuclear strikes that the United States presumably could use against Iran, nuclear strikes do nothing against hardened tunneled bases. They don't have that penetrating effect. In fact, the United States does not have the military capability to even like those bunker buster bombs that they talked about, like during the 12-day war that hit the nuclear strikes, presumably, they didn't collapse the underground nuclear sites because Iran's sites are hardened and they're deep underground. And so tactically and strategically, nuclear strikes are not going to affect Iran's military capacity. It's just about terrorizing people and breaking the spirit of the people. And that's the only mechanism, largely the only mechanism that the Zionist imperialists have at this point to gain whatever leverage that they might gain. Because militarily, they're not doing anything. And I'll also add, even by trying to break the spirit of the people, in fact, the spirit of the people becomes stronger and stronger each day. And we see that with the fact that people come out in the millions every night in Iran. When Trump threatens to bomb power plants and bridges, where do people go? They go to power plants and bridges. They lay down on bridges. They form human chains around power plants. Even against the wishes of their own government, they do that because the government says you're putting yourself in harm's way. This is a people's war. It is a people's war and a people's resistance.
Thanks, Navid. Yeah, it's a powerful note to end on. I mean, we could wrap it here. Or Lima, did you have a comment?
Just a quick comment. I guess I was referring in the chat to reports of new weapons being used in, I think it was in northern Gaza by the Israelis, wasn't something that came from them directly from their own manufacturing. It was not an armament of the US. And the effects of what happened, I don't know if people read about that, signifies potentially the use of small tactical nuclear warheads. And the fact that in many military discourse from veterans or service members, from people who were on national security advising roles, we're saying that, there have been discussions and war games on using tactical nuclear arms, specifically in the smaller capacity in many different theaters of war, I guess. And so I honestly question, and I think a lot of people are beginning to question whether it's a smokescreen, this discussion around, the use of nuclear warheads, the fear of nuclear warheads, the proliferation of it, and all this kind of like nonsense, because they've always planned for it. We can even speculate that they're currently using it and hiding it from the world, and we wouldn't know, right?
Yeah. There is one final question. I don't know if we can sneak that in really quickly, and then if you want to respond to what Halima said as well. The final question was just addressing this domestic discourse that's really prevalent in the US, or rising at least, that this is Israel's war on Iran, and the US is being pulled into it against its will and against its interests. And I was just hoping you could respond to that discourse and how speak to how you would frame US interests in this war. Thank you.
We're actually working on the Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective is working on a red paper on the Ramadan War, and we actually spend a lot of time discussing this. If you do a political economic analysis of US-Israeli relations, of US-Zionist relations, you will see that Israel could not exist, literally, without the United States. Literally. The funding comes primarily from two sources. The first source, the more important source, is the tax base, the Israeli tax base. So that's income taxes, property taxes, corporate taxes, etc. Which means that the basis for that income is the settler colonial project, right? None of that, income taxes, property taxes, corporate, none of that can be generated without the settler colonial project. The other element of the tax base, of the income, is US money, US funding, which is used for defense. So the US money, the US income protects the settler income, the income generated through the settler colonial project. If you eliminate the US money, the whole thing falls apart. The whole thing will fall apart. And even like the most rabid Zionists have said, like we need to like stop relying on the Americans so much because they're no longer a reliable, they're just too chaotic and unreliable. The MAGA base is, whatever. So it's just not the idea that Israel dragged the US into this is complete crap. The US has been planning this for generations, like, of political leadership. Hillary Clinton was like, if I'm in charge, I'm gonna kill, I'm gonna go after them. It's bipartisan across generations. They've wanted to get rid of Iran, and there's been a war on the Iranian people since at least an American war on the Iranian people since at least 1953. At least 1953. So, really before. But, now, does that mean that the Israelis and the US agree all the time on everything? Of course not. Of course not. And even the American politicians don't agree all the time on everything. But they're unified when it comes to the imperial project. And the US is just a glorified military. I'm sorry, well, the US too, but Israel is just a glorified military base. That is all it is. That is all it is.
I agree with everything Nina said. I also want to approach this question from perhaps a different angle, which is to say if your task is to build an anti-war movement here in the United States and you're trying to address this question, I think that one way to address this question and to organize people is to say that, like all imperialist wars, this is a ruling class war. That this is a ruling class war against Iran versus a people's war of resistance, right? And the reason why I say that is because then you can more easily make the linkages between, okay, you're proposing a what, $1.5 trillion budget on defense for next year, at the same time that you're cutting funding for education, you're cutting funding for housing, you're cutting funding for of course welfare to whatever extent that it still exists, right? So these are the connections that need to be made, and to show that, it's the ruling class in the United States that is waging this war, and that is, of course, that is siphoning resources from the U.S. and largely from the Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples, we should be clear, right? To wage a war that maintains its military outpost in the West Asia region, and to maintain its influence and its imperialist project in that region as well. And so those are the connections that I think need to be made, particularly if you're building an anti-war movement. I mentioned this elsewhere, like in Vietnam, the anti-war movement really didn't take off until the US sent ground troops into Southeast Asia en masse, right? The US had sent military advisors in the late 50s, early 60s, but it was not until 1965, when the US sent ground troops in the hundreds of thousands, that the anti-war movement really took off. So, that means, unfortunately, that most people here in this country see imperialist wars in terms of their own interests. Like, like if you have family members who are being sent to war and are dying, that's what spurs people to go into an anti-war movement, right? The task, therefore, becomes to link those individual interests on the ground with the interests of anti-imperialism elsewhere as well. And so, I'm thinking of that question in this way. What does it mean to fight a ruling class war? Whose war is this in the first place, right? And I think the Iranians have been clear on this as well, because a lot of the Iranian rhetoric that is like being espoused by Iranian officials is that, like, the Zionists are like, basically, pointing the direction for the US to go in, right? They're not doing this because they don't understand that the US is in fact sustaining the Zionist project. They're doing it because they're trying to fracture the linkages between the two, right? And so they're trying to, they're basically stoking the MAGA rhetoric in many respects, not because they're pro-MAGA, but because they understand, like, that in fact this is a ruling class war in the interest of the transnational ruling class between the United States and the Zionist regime, right? So I think that should be made clear, and organizing circles and these kinds of things as well. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I'm thinking of that latest Lego video and how it's pointing again and again to US government violence against its own people. So it is trying to sever that. Yeah, I really appreciate the ending on the messaging note, because I think, all of us, our hearts are with Lebanon and Palestine and Cuba and Iran and the people who are actually bearing the brunt of this violence. And we're not, just here to sharpen our analysis, but we're trying to, learn how to think and speak about these things so that we can put it into practice with our organizing. And I know all of us here are organizing in different spaces. So yeah, I just really wanted to thank you guys again. Like, you're both so generous with your time and you've taught me tons. And I'm sure that's true for everybody else here. So yeah, thank you so much. I guess we'll wrap it. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you
so
all
much.
for doing this. Yeah, it's an honor to be in conversation with you.
That was really,
Thank
really
you so
sweet.
much, guys. It was
Thank you.
very, very informative. And like Britt said, really appreciate the time that you took to do this with us. And thank you so much for everyone who joined with your questions. I think that just made everything really, really powerful.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Bye. Take care. Till victory.
And till victory.